to the 2340th meeting and tonight's lecture on the 35 years GMO war. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Nina Fedoroff. Nina is Evan Pugh Professor of Biology and Williman Professor of Life Science at Penn State University. She is a member of the external faculty of the Santa Fe Institute and Distinguished Professor of Biosciences, Emerita of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia, also fondly known as KAUST. She also served as science advisor to the Global Knowledge Initiative, which she established. She is a trustee of the Library of Alexandria in Egypt and also serves on the Science Advisory Board of the Santa Fe Institute. Nina received her BS from Syracuse University and her PhD in molecular biology from Rockefeller University. She was a member of the faculty at the Carnegie Institution and then at Johns Hopkins before joining the faculty at Penn State. At Penn State, she served as director of the Biotechnology Institute and as founding director of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. She's the author of 3 books, including Mendel's Kitchen, and more than 160 papers in scientific journals. She is a past president of AAAS, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she was awarded the National Medal of Science in 2006. Please hold questions to the end and join me in welcoming Nina to the podium.
Thank you, Larry, for the lovely introduction. And it would be really good if I had some power here.
Do you want some help with that?
Too much modern technology here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, I've parodied the 100 Years' War designation a bit. But what I'm going to try to do is tell you a bit about the history, put it in a global context, and address the issues about why it matters whether we, thank you, whether or not we get over the current controversy in society about GMOs. Now, a couple of nights ago, I attended a very lively debate, public debate on genetically modified organisms, also known as GMOs, part of the Intelligence Squared debate series held at the Kaufman Center in New York City. Now, arguing for genetically modified foods were Rob Fraley, Executive VP and Chief Technology Officer of Monsanto, and UC Professor Alison Van Enenum. Arguing against were Chuck Benbrook, who spent many years here in Washington, maybe some of you knew him, and Marty Mellon, again, a denizen of Washington, used to be with the Union of Concerned Scientists and now is a consultant for the Center for Food Safety. Now, the debate attracted a huge audience, both online and in the hall. And the organizers told me that they were getting 20 tweets a second by the time it wound down. And if, as I hope, my talk whets your appetite for learning more, just Google IQ squared debates, IQ2 debates. So what's this hot issue all about? Are GMOs a public menace, as some would seek to convince us? Certainly if you go online, you get an immense amount of negative stuff about GMOs. Or are they an essential technology for expanding agriculture for a still growing population in a world with a warming climate? So what is a genetically modified organism, or a GMO? Now today, it means an organism, most controversially a crop plant, that's been modified by the addition of genes or genetic material using modern molecular methods. Let me start, however, with the larger context of the relationship between food and civilization. Today we live in a mobile, technologically sophisticated, largely urban society. Our shops and supermarkets are just bursting with produce. We have an amazing global food system that brings food from wherever it's produced on Earth to those who can buy it. And that's the rub, to those who can buy it. In 2008, food prices spiked. Riots broke out in 30 countries and governments fell. Food prices moderated for a few years and then spiked again. And the Arab Spring began.
Angry protesters burning tires, blocking roads and attacking the police with fireworks in the Algerian capital. They are protesting over the rise in food prices and unemployment.
We do not accept this government because we have been suffering for 10 years, and 10 more years are coming and nothing will have changed.
Anti-riot squads deployed in many Algerian cities as a simmering anger threatens massive protests in the oil and gas-rich North African country.
The government is humiliating us. They're raising the price of sugar. We have to pay the rent, the electricity, water, sugar, and oil. We're all poor.
You all know how that ended. If you think that's an anomaly, watch this. The vertical red lines indicate when, the flags indicate where food riots broke out. You can see they track very well. It's a sobering thought. Can the survival of governance, indeed civilizations, ride on food? Let's look back for a moment. For most of our evolutionary history, we were hunter-gatherers. We spent our days finding and capturing food. Then sometime between 10 or 20,000 years ago, we began to shape plants and animals to our own advantage and settle down to grow and herd them. That, of course, is agriculture. Agriculture allowed us to feed more than just ourselves and our families. We could feed scribes and artisans and warriors and kings. For millennia, civilizations rose and fell, generally lasting until the land wore out, or until the neighbors invaded, having worn out their own. As plants extract nutrients from the soil, crop yields decline, making it harder and harder to produce enough food as the number of people grows. Around the turn of the 18th century, Thomas Malthus told us that we were forever doomed to hunger and strife because our numbers inevitably grew faster than our food supply. So if Malthus thought the game was over when we were just 1 billion people on the face of the planet, how did we get to today's 7 billion? Now, curiously, it was just about the time that Malthus was penning his gloomy predictions that science began to enter agriculture. Over the next 2 centuries, synthetic fertilizers, genetics, and the internal combustion engine transformed agriculture and set in motion the most profound changes ever in human civilization. For those of you who aren't biologists, plants do something altogether miraculous. They produce sugars out of water and thin air. Well, technically it's the carbon dioxide in the air. But they also need nitrogen. And while there's plenty of it in the air, most plants can't use atomic nitrogen. Manure contains nitrogen in the right kinds of chemical forms, and it's been used as fertilizers since prehistoric times. The problem is there just isn't much nitrogen in manure, so it takes a lot to fertilize crops. And one thing we forget is that you really have to feed the animals that produce it. About a century ago, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch figured out how to convert atmospheric nitrogen to compounds plants can use. Today that's done in huge factories in plants around the world. We simply couldn't have gotten from 1 to 7 billion without synthetic fertilizer. Genetics was critical as well. Nobel Prize laureate Norman Borlaug is considered the father of the Green Revolution that set the populous and famine-plagued Asian countries on the road out of poverty. And what you might not know is that the Green Revolution was based on mutations, genetic changes that let crops take advantage of fertilizer, doubling and tripling yields. That's genetic modification. GM, today we vilify it. I'll get back to that. And there's the internal combustion engine. Agriculture was hard, physical work for most people for most of our history. The populace was largely agrarian, even in the most advanced countries, until well into the 20th century. As tractors and other machines took over the work, ever fewer people could produce ever more food. People moved to cities, which became hotbeds of invention and collaboration. Technology-based wealth generation accelerated, giving us all the machines, gadgets, and comforts of modern life. Even the internet, even Twitter. So what does the future hold? Was Malthus just plain wrong because he didn't figure on science? Or might there be limits to the planet's ability to provision us? Let's look at some trends. Population growth is slowing, but it's not likely to stop short of 10 billion. In fact, the most recent projections are that it will go much higher than that. Technology is powering the emergence of country after country from poverty. As people get richer, they want to eat more meat. Switching from a grain diet to a meat diet ups the demand for feed grain, which increases the demand for land. But there isn't any more. In fact, we're losing it to urbanization, desertification, and salinization faster than we're adding it. If we don't change what we're doing, we'll be back to Malthus within our lifetime. Maybe not our lifetimes, but certainly our children's and grandchildren's. Then there's the warming climate. Our major food and feed crops were domesticated in a milder climate. Yields drop at higher temperatures. The X marks the hot summer of 2003 in Europe. It was just 3 degrees above average for the last century. Crop yields dropped as much as 25 to 50%, depending on the crop. Think about that. That'll be an average summer in a few decades and a cool summer by any of the projections by the end of the century. And then there's water. The most productive agriculture is irrigated, and the most reliable water comes from deep underground, from fossil aquifers. These are being exhausted ever faster everywhere in the world. We're doing it to our Ogallala aquifer. Saudi Arabia, where I was working until recently, has exhausted 80% of its groundwater. These aren't good trends. Our past successes in our bursting food markets have lulled us, most of us are city folk today, into thinking that Malthus is history. But Norman Borlaug understood that food security was a battle that was never decisively won. In his Nobel speech, he said, "We may be at high tide now, but ebb tide will soon set in if we become complacent and relax our efforts." That's just what we've done. We've shrunk our investments in agricultural research and innovation the world around, largely leaving the job to big agribusiness, which we then vilify. Think Monsanto. We've taken to the notion of organic food because we think it's more natural. But that can't work on a global scale. The primary tenet of organic farming is a prohibition on the use of synthetic fertilizers. If the entire world went organic, we could feed about half of today's population. So can we feed 10 billion people? I think so. But I think we have to think and act at a different level of integration. Agriculture, as we all know, is a complex interacting system. Let's see if I can get this. Yeah. There it goes. Of water, energy, nutrients, environment, and of course people. Have to optimize the system as a whole. Very easy to say, very hard to do. So let me just give you a few specifics. It's a very complicated issue, and I can't cover it all in a few minutes. Yields need to go up using less water and less land. That's captured in today's mantra of more crop per drop. One contribution is moving high-value crops like tomatoes indoors, already happening in many countries. While investing in modern greenhouses is capital intensive, it's especially important in arid climates. This is a modern greenhouse in Southern California that produces 5 to 10 times more tomatoes per unit area than open fields, on the order of 75 to 100 kilograms per square meter per year, using as little as 1/10 as much water. We can build greenhouses in cities, on rooftops, in deserts. Indeed, innovation in desert greenhouse design was one of the projects that I was initiated at the King Abdullah University, better known as KAUST. Greenhouses are boxes built for cold climates to trap heat. How do we redesign them to achieve water efficiency without driving energy requirements for cooling through the roof? It can be done. It's not rocket science, but people aren't paying much attention to it. And yet we won't grow our grain under glass. Today, farmers apply 100 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer to their fields each year. Much of it ends up in our waterways, killing them. Getting nutrients directly to the plant roots just when and where they're needed is one of the challenges. Fertigation is one such technique, but there's much more to be invented, including energy-efficient methods for the synthesis of nitrogen fertilizer. Then there's insecticides. Globally, we use about 1 billion pounds a year, killing both pests like this corn earworm and beneficial insects. The molecular and genomic revolutions of the last half century have made it possible to do this biologically rather than with toxic chemicals. Take GM corn, shown here. It's just like any other corn, but it has a single gene added to it. The gene was taken from a safe bacterium long used as an insecticide by ordinary farmers, backyard farmers, and organic farmers. But that single gene was inserted directly into the genome of the corn plant, making the corn essentially immune to the attack of the insect. This innovation has been adopted the world around, decreasing pesticide use and farmer costs, both contributing to a more sustainable agriculture. Now, Rachel Carson, whose book Silent Spring started the environmental movement, dreamed of a day that we could use biology rather than chemistry to control pathogens and pests. Today we can, but ironically, environmentalists are amongst the most vocal opponents of genetic modification, of modern genetic modification. Now, today's crops, modified by molecular techniques, are the only ones called GM or GMO. And these are primarily the major commodity crops: corn, cotton, soybeans, and canola, all developed and brought to market by large biotech companies, you know, the ones that everybody loves to hate. But the good news is that GM crops have been adopted more rapidly around the world than any new crop varieties in history. Indeed, in 2013, GM crops were grown in 27 countries on just over 175 million hectares. You can see from this map that Western Hemisphere countries have been friendlier to GMOs than the rest of the world. Europe's anti-GMO attitudes and regulatory policies have exerted a severe inhibitory influence on the acceptance of GM crops, not just in Europe, but in Africa and beyond. Now, for those of you who like numbers, let me talk very briefly and give you one of my few slides that has a lot of verbiage on it. So the impact of GM crops has been analyzed by several authors, and I'm just quoting one. GM crop technology has added more than $100 billion to farmer income globally. About half of the increase was in developing countries. Yield increases attributable to GM traits, and you will uniformly on the internet find that this has not happened, but it has, were more than double digit. Now, going on to environmental impacts of GM crops, the total is more than 500 million kilograms less of the active ingredient of pesticides, greenhouse gas reduction of more than 16 billion kilograms, and increased soil carbon sequestration from no-till farming as much as an order of magnitude more. Now, we only have these big commodity crops, and there are very few specialty crops. Those are the fruits and vegetables we all take home from the supermarket. The single public sector GMO success story was the papaya ring spot virus resistant variety that gave the Hawaiian papaya industry, that saved the Hawaiian papaya industry in the early 1990s. Now, why is that? The major reason why few specialty crops are in the pipeline is the prohibitive cost of the current regulatory processes. Just to bring one new variety to market costs upwards of $100 million. That's more than most small biotech companies can manage and more than specialty seed markets can absorb. And beyond that is just the complexity of the regulatory approval. Most specialty crops today remain in what I call regulatory purgatory. BT eggplant has finally been approved in Bangladesh. Simplot's potato, late blight-resistant potatoes, and many other crops await and have awaited approval, often for years. And genetically, I've talked mostly about crops, but animals and insects approval remain even more difficult. You've probably all read about Equibounty's transgenic salmon. It has served its time in regulatory purgatory. It's been 10 years under examination. It's now in regulatory limbo, neither disapproved nor approved by FDA. Whether that company will manage to survive long enough to make a significant contribution to aquaculture, which the Equibounty salmon can, remains uncertain. Another example is a transgenic system developed by a little British company called Oxitec to produce male sterile mosquitoes. So the male sterile mosquitoes are an extremely effective measure for controlling mosquito-borne diseases, particularly dengue. Brazil has just approved their commercial release, but it's still stuck in the regulatory approval process here in the US. Now, the most difficult issue in assuring future food security isn't the science. It's the people, policies, and politics. When recombinant DNA technology was first being developed in the early 1970s, a handful of high-profile scientists became concerned about the possibility that combining genes across species, genera, and kingdoms might create organisms with unexpected and harmful new traits. They published a note in Science requesting that the NIH establish an advisory committee to oversee experimentation with the new techniques and organize the renowned 1975 Asilomar Conference. Pictured here are four of the key spokespeople: Maxine Singer, Norton Zinder, Sidney Brenner, and Paul Berg. The requested advisory body, subsequently known as the NIH Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, was duly constituted. By the NIH director developed guidelines for containment procedures. Since it wasn't known whether these organisms would be safe or not, sorry, I think I missed one piece of that slide. So this is the Asilomar Conference, and this is the early Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee. I actually served on that in the early 1980s. Now, the very most important point about this advisory committee, it was advisory, but both industry and academic scientists paid attention to what its regulations. The regulations were all published as they were. So the salient point is that much of what that Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee did was to look at the science underlying the regulations, collect data, and then decide whether the early stringent regulations should be kept in force. So much of it was constantly loosening the requirements, the containment procedures, as data accumulated about the safety of approaching of the recombinant data technology. Now, that all began to change when the first request to test field test plants came in around 1984. Representatives of regulatory agencies began to attend RAC meetings, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, known to most of you as OSTP, organized an interagency committee to consider how transgenic plants should be regulated. The committee wrote the coordinated framework for regulation of biotechnology, and after publication for public comment, it was implemented in 1986. The committee concluded that the use of recombinant techniques was not inherently risky and therefore didn't require new legislation, but could be regulated under existing statutes. It directed the agencies, which were the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to identify the most relevant statutes. Now, that's where the problems started, if not before, because, for example, the EPA used TSCA and FIFRA. TSCA is the Toxic Substances Control Act, and FIFRA is basically the Federal Insecticide and Rodenticide Act, to regulate these plants. Now, about that same time, and alarmed by the emerging regulatory environment for GE plants, the Council of the National Academy of Sciences issued a white paper in 1987 titled The Introduction of Recombinant DNA Engineered Organisms into the Environment, Key Issues. Now, the paper basically concluded that there were no unique risks associated with the use of molecular biology to modify the genomes of crop plants, and recommended that regulation should be based on the properties of the organisms, not the process by which it was created. But the damage was done. Regulation became de facto process-based and hugely expensive, reinforcing public perceptions that GMOs were fearful. Google GMOs today, and you'll find they've been blamed for farmer suicides in India, tumors in rats, and every manner of human ill, from autism to obesity to infertility and cancer. This is just a picture from a publication. Now, fortunately, none of this is true, and this happens over and over again. In 2010, the EU issued a report summarizing 25 years of biosafety research costing upwards of 300 million euros. Its main conclusion, crop modification by GM techniques is no more dangerous than crop modification by older methods. Every credible scientific body that has looked at the evidence has come to the same conclusion. But the GMO wars rage on, fueled by electronic gossip and organizations that exploit GMOs and GMO fears for profit. Years of careful GM work on important crops like golden rice have been destroyed around the world. Golden rice is a rice variety modified to produce beta-carotene, a vitamin A precursor, giving it the color that it's named for. This has the potential to prevent the blindness associated with vitamin A deficiency in poor countries, heavily reliant on rice, and prevent as many as several million premature deaths of women and children. But it remains and has remained for a decade in the regulatory process. I am quite doubtful that we'll manage to dismantle the regulatory tangle we've created around transgenic organisms. But there are new technologies that do not involve the creation of transgenic plants and therefore offer us an opportunity to ease agricultural biotechnology out of the costly regulatory bind it's in. In the best of all possible world, it offers an opportunity to base regulation on the properties of the product, not the process used to create it. What will it take? Courageous leaders willing to stand behind science-based regulation. I don't see that here right now in the US at the moment. But I see hopeful signs in South America, Bangladesh, and Canada, perhaps even under the new leadership in India. So let me finish by telling you how the voting came out in the debate I told you about at the beginning. In the audience vote, before the debate, 32% were pro-GMO, 32% against, and 38% undivided. The debate changes the minds of almost half of the voters, doubling the number of positive votes. I encourage you to view the whole debate. There's the link, but if you can't get it, just Google IQ2 debates. Now, in summary, we're approaching a tipping point. We expect 10 billion humans for dinner in the not too distant future. How we meet their demands for food will again reshape civilization. Will we continue to ignore facts and cling to fear-based belief systems? Will the simmering embers of poverty-based social instability grow to civilization-consuming conflagrations? Or will we be able to weigh the pros and cons of new technologies and actually use them? Will we succeed in creating the knowledge civilization to which we all aspire? Will we have the wisdom to invest in the scientific and technological advances that can provide everyone a livelihood, a seat at the table, and enough to eat? We certainly can. Will we? I don't know. Thank you. I'm pleased to take any and all questions.
We have some questions. Time for questions. We have some runners with microphones. Would you please raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question? Wait until the microphone comes to you. Stand up. Tell me your name. Tell us your name and whether you're a member or you're not. No penalty for not being a member.
Thank you. I'm David Burtz. I am a member. And I was wondering why Monsanto is so determined to prevent the labeling of genetically modified foods. That campaign against the labeling creates fear.
While I understand that it does create fear, labeling is actually an extremely complicated issue. The FDA labels food when there's a health issue or an environmental issue. There are no issues that have involved. Yes, I mean.
Not even close. When it says so much potassium on the label, that's not a health issue.
What I mean by health issue is nutritional issue. Yes, it is a health issue. Okay? Those are the words that the FDA uses. And the point is that there are no nutritional differences between GM crops and non-GM crops that are on the market today. When there are such differences, they will, and they are significant in a health or nutrition context, they will undoubtedly be labeled. But the FDA has so far not mandated any kind of labeling for GM products. Now, that's only one of the issues. Another issue is that these are commodity crops that are on the market at the moment. If you want to segregate them, to segregate crops that look the same, taste the same, and have the same nutritional value, you can only detect the difference by an expensive test. Okay? That means that you're creating a whole industry for lawyers and regulators and so forth. And where does the cost of that fall? It falls on the poorest, who spend the largest amount of their let's not take everybody's time with this. I can send you a link to a publication that gives you the entire breakdown of it's not a trivial issue. Yes?
My name is Scott Matthews, and I am a member. And I was wondering if you could comment on the intellectual property issues associated with GMOs. Specifically, I think there are a lot of people that may not be inherently anti-GMO, and when they find out that companies like Monsanto hold patents, they actually own the intellectual property of a genetic sequence which was originally naturally occurring. Can you just please comment on intellectual property?
Yes. The patent protection of plant varieties goes back to the 30s. They were actually the first living organisms that were patentable. And that came out of traditional breeding. The breeders felt that, we can patent a mousetrap or copyright a tune, but a breeder can work a lifetime, and anybody can steal that work. So the Patent Protection Act, the first Patent Protection Act, dates to the 30s. This is not news, okay? And that simply is the basis for the current patent protection. The cost of the research that goes into creating genetically modified crops or any kind of crop varieties is quite huge today. And it has been all along. Okay? Did you have something?
I'm going to leap in because I'm a patent attorney who works on this kind of thing. And I'm just going to say that there's a great deal of misinformation and misunderstanding about not only the basics of what you can get a patent on and what you can't, but of many recent rulings, including the recent ruling involving Monsanto. So I don't want to go into it right now, but I will talk to you about it later, and anybody else who wants to get an explanation of what the state of the law really is, I'll be happy to do that. I am kind of the Darth Vader of DNA sequencing patents because I was the Chief Patent Counsel at Human Genome Sciences for a while.
Next question. Maybe somebody in back?
My name is Rudy Krutar. I am a member. I am not anti-GMO, but the issue that I find troublesome is the dangers of having a monoculture, that all the crops are the same, and so we lose the genetic variety we currently have. We have a National Colonial Farm south of D.C. that is devoted to preserving colonial crops because we're losing a lot of them. And can you address the issue of monocultures?
Okay, so the issue of monoculture is often conflated with the issue of genetic modification. The issue of monoculture long predates. It turns out that monocultures are more productive than mixed cultures, okay? That's how things have gone. We don't lose the heirloom varieties so long as they're preserved. There's a whole crop variety trust, which not only collects those varieties from all over the world, where they're banked in many different places, often at the CG centers. The CGIAR is the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, out of which the Green Revolution strains came. Many of those centers have their own banks, but in addition, there's an organization in Rome that has a storage facility in permafrost in Svalbard in northernmost northern Norway. It is refrigerated to chilled to minus 15 degrees centigrade, and representatives of all of these varieties are collected there for crop varieties. Okay, we don't lose those. We don't use them in the ways that were used before. Okay, as long as you're growing them out or storing them in the cold, they will last. I've grown seeds that have been stored under ordinary conditions for more than 15 years. So the whole seed banking business is you grow out things, you select the seeds, you store them, you record them, you analyze them. So that crop variety is preserved. Today, because we can move single genes and you don't have the drag associated with moving whole chromosomes when you do conventional breeding, you can transfer a gene. Let me give you an example. The Irish potato famine was caused by a fungus, Phytophthora, which the commercial potatoes don't have any resistance to. It causes billions of dollars worth of damage to potato crops every year, and farmers spray their fields with fungicides 12 to 15 times in a season. By just understanding, by the research that went into understanding how crops protect themselves from pathogens, not crops, but plants protect themselves from pathogens, scientists have identified the disease resistance gene, and using these new techniques, molecular techniques, have been able to move one from a completely useless wild potato, which is largely, the potatoes are in the nightshade family and toxic, into a commercial potato, just like that. And people are against it. Okay, so that genetic diversity isn't lost, it's just being used in different ways. Yes?
Yeah, this whole discussion reminds
your
me.
name and member?
My name is James Griffin, and I'm a visitor. Reminds me of the nuclear versus coal-powered argument that was resolved by 3 Mile Island when it was emerged that the nuclear industry, which was to protect our society against nuclear accidents, was incompetent. And that was the end of the game for nuclear power.
Correct.
It strikes me that this is a sociological question, and I'm conflicted in myself because I suspect that when industrial monopolies are telling me how well they're protecting my welfare, I believe they're likely to be lying, if necessary, for their profits. And so the real problem that I have is in control. In the nuclear case, we did have a nuclear industry, and it showed itself to be out of control, and we voted in the United States against nuclear power. My colleagues in East Bloc at that time said, "What are you doing? Nuclear power is so wonderful." Moscow was building reactors next to metro stations because their bureaucracy was so inbred that they were incapable.
Okay, can I answer your question? I think there's a kernel of a question there. Okay. Yes. There's one profound difference between nuclear energy and GMOs. There are known quantifiable risks associated with the nuclear industry. After 30, going out to 40 years of research, we have not identified a single risk associated with the use of molecular techniques to modify crop plants. Okay? They remain hypothetical. Now, we could wait another 20 or 30 or 40 years, but the fact of the matter is, literally billions of plants have been created. There are no monsters. There are no environmental, all of the effects, the unexpected effects that have surfaced have been benign. So for example, corn that has a Bt gene in it is less susceptible to the invasion of insects. Insects bore holes and fungi follow the insects and cause contamination with fungal mycotoxins, which are carcinogenic and toxic, okay? No hole, no insects, no hole, insect holes, no fungi, no mycotoxins. Surprise. That's just one of them. The point is that we've been looking for more than a quarter of a century for problems and haven't found them.
Hi. Kristen Ferry, I am a member and I am also a farmer. One of my biggest problems in Central Virginia now is actually invasive plant species. For example, a tree from China, different grasses and weeds. I have heard it argued that one of the dangers of GMO organisms might be creating a new invasive plant species that would be a kind of double whammy. Not only would it be stealing resources that I should be putting into growing my sheep or whatever, but it could also bring down an intellectual property lawsuit on me because it was a patented organism. So I'm wondering, I've heard this story. I'm wondering.
Formulate your question. You've got to.
I'm wondering if this concern is a real concern. Is there data out there? Because I have heard it frequently mentioned.
Yes. Now, the real issue there is the overuse of a single herbicide. Okay? And that's glyphosate. Glyphosate has been used an awful lot. It was adopted extremely fast because it's much more benign than its predecessors. Okay, overusing. you all are, or some of you are scientists, but the way genetics and evolution work is that you apply some sort of a selective pressure, and what you get are things that are resistant to that. It happens with insecticides, happens with herbicides. It's a problem that doesn't have to do with GMOs. It has to do with the fact that we're overusing a single herbicide for all the right reasons, but you have a wrong outcome. The answer to that is to develop more different systems of an herbicide and an herbicide-tolerant crop. It's just like crop rotation. If you have 3 of them, the resistant ones don't build up, okay? But because it is so costly, it's been very slow, and people they're just beginning to increase the number of different ones. But that is a real problem that people conflate with the use of the genetic modification. Now, there are pluses and minuses, and the reason that people have adopted the herbicide-tolerant crops so readily is because it decreases the need for plowing, which you know what that does, and so soil erosion rates have gone down primarily because of the no-till farming that is enabled by the GM crops. So the answer is not to abolish the GM crop, it's to develop several systems and encourage farmers to rotate the crops. You can't go backwards because your problem isn't going to go away.
We'll take 2 more. Can we get one from the back of the room there?
Yeah, it'd be good.
My name is Peter van Oevelen. I'm a visitor. First of all, I want to thank you for the interesting presentation and being an eloquent proponent of GMOs. But I want to tilt this discussion a little bit more to the philosophical side. And you showed one slide where you basically linked water, energy, and people and food. So my question is the real premise of the problem not the amount of people we have on the globe versus trying to do the catch-up game with increasing our technological advancement to try to feed all those people? How do you feel as a scientist about that?
Well, if I had a magic wand and I could forbid everyone in the world from eating hamburgers, I'd have eliminated the problem. But I'd probably have to institute some kind of draconian population control. And telling people not to eat meat and telling them they can't have babies is probably more difficult, okay? And probably at the moment, you know, the point is that all of these processes, there's not an either or, okay? We really have to address the issues of poverty, of education. All of those take money, investment. Population growth rates go down when people have more wealth and don't have to have, and have access to birth control, okay? Those are all complicated issues. And you can't stop and say, well, we're not going to do this anymore because we're going to have a world government that's going to decree that nobody has babies anymore, and you know. Anyway, they're all complicated issues. And if we could solve it very simply by declaring no more hamburgers, somebody would have done it, but there's no one in the world that can do that. And frankly, you know, wealthy cultures can't, in good conscience, that have a very high consumption of beef, can't stand around and say to people emerging from poverty that they can't increase the amount of meat in their diet.
No, I agree
What?
with that.
Yeah.
The point is that I think it's very important to make the case that we need to do something, and without realizing that the real problem is not so much in genetic modification as well as it is in all these other things. I think it's essential for us to realize.
It's all of the above. It's not either or. That's why I put that integrated picture. People are very much part of that equation. And Mark Bittman wrote a recent editorial in the New York Times saying, well, you know, the problem isn't food, it's just poverty. Okay, well, what are you going to do about that? Yes, it is about poverty if you have food. And that's the central issue of the global food supply. If you have money, it doesn't matter where you live, you can buy food. Okay?
One last question.
But all these things are very intertwined. Yes?
David
Question.
Rosen, lifetime member. I first want to say you're right, and if anyone doesn't believe it, look at the cheese. The wine, who's going for the, how many people go for the cheese at the wine and cheese in the back. But I was thinking that most of this stuff with the GMOs involves developing resistance to pathogens. Well, pathogens evolve. There's a diverse, they have a lot of biodiversity. So I do know of negative things that were done. For example, the BT toxin in Hawaii, some of the butterflies developed it. What's this about evolving pathogens?
That's an urban myth. Okay, that's the monarch butterfly story. Some researchers at Cornell force-fed larvae of monarch butterflies on pollen from corn. Well, this triggered a huge study that went from Canada into Maryland out to the Midwest. The results of that study were published in 5 back-to-back papers in the same month as 9/11 happened, and didn't get any attention whatsoever. The conclusion was that in the worst case scenario, with strains that were had a high content of the toxin in the pollen, the worst case scenario they could construct is that 1 out of 2,500 larvae would be affected. So the point is, the biggest impact, curiously enough, has been on the fact that there are fewer weeds in fields. Monarch butterflies primarily feed on milkweed. And as you control the milkweed population more, the food sources go down. So that's an indirect consequence, but perfectly solvable, because actually milkweed has been used as a food, and a good one. We could convert it to an industry. And sorry. I think I should stop talking.
Well, I wish we had more time, but I'd like to. Okay.
It's the end of a cold.
Just move to the middle of the stage for a minute.
Pardon?
Move to the middle of the stage for a minute. So that's good. An appreciation for your coming here and presenting this lecture. We'd like to present you with a copy of the announcement of your talk signed by the members of the General Committee on behalf of the membership. Thank you very much.
Thank you. When I recover from this coughing spell, I'm delighted to answer any other questions that you have
Well, when we go to
in the
in the
entertainment session.
I have a few